I knew something was wrong before I even understood what I was looking at. The number on my screen didn't just look smaller. It looked impossible. 3 weeks earlier, my trust fund held just over $1.6 million, my grandmother's inheritance. The one account in my marriage that was never supposed to be touched. That morning, sitting at my kitchen island in Charleston with my coffee still steaming beside me, I logged in to transfer money into my son's education account. The balance read $8,412. I blinked, refreshed the page, logged out, logged back in. The number stayed exactly the same, like it was daring me to accept it. Then I scrolled down. Wire transfer after wire transfer. Clean, precise, deliberate. Each one routed into Whitmore Technologies, my husband's company. My throat tightened as I checked the dates. 3 days after the largest transfer, Grant had posted photos from a yacht in Savannah Harbor. Champagne in one hand, his arm wrapped loosely around a woman I didn't recognize. The caption read, "Celebrating bold moves?" He was smiling like a man who believed he had outsmarted everyone. He believed I was powerless. He was wrong. I pressed my palms against the cold marble counter and forced myself to breathe. Panic would not fix this. Numbers would. I called the bank's private client line. My voice sounded steady, almost detached, as I confirmed my identity. "Yes, Mrs. Whitmore," the banker said after a pause. The transfers were authorized through linked access credentials. Linked how? I asked. There is an operational visibility connection between your account and a corporate entity listed under your spouse's profile. Visibility, not ownership, not permission, just access. I remembered when Grant had asked for limited visibility years ago, saying it would make liquidity coordination easier in case of emergencies. I had agreed because I believed emergencies were things that happened to families, not things husbands engineered. I ended the call and pulled up our shared email account. No transaction alerts. No security notifications. I checked the account settings and felt my stomach drop. 2-step authentication had been reassigned to his office number months ago. Alert forwarding had been disabled. This wasn't impulsive. It was prepared. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen while the house stayed quiet around me. Our son was at school. The dishwasher hummed. The world outside our windows carried on as if nothing had shifted. But something fundamental had. That trust fund wasn't just money. It was my grandmother's estate, structured as separate property before I ever married. She had been clear about it. "This is your stability," she told me once, her hand resting over mine. "Never let anyone gamble what you didn't earn together." Grant knew that story. He had heard it at our wedding reception. That evening, I texted him, "We need to talk about the transfers from my trust." He responded almost immediately. "Strategic liquidity bridge. Temporary. I'll explain tonight. Strategic. Liquidity. Bridge. Words designed to make theft sound intelligent." After dinner, while he was still at the office, I opened Instagram. I don't know what I expected to feel. Maybe reassurance. Maybe proof that I was overreacting. Instead, I saw the yacht, Savannah Harbor glowing gold in the sunset. A catered spread. Investors smiling. And beside Grant stood a woman tagged as Alyssa Kane, partner at a venture capital firm that specialized in aggressive fintech growth plays. Her hand rested lightly on his arm. Diamond studs caught the light at her ears. The caption read, "Celebrating bold moves with visionary partners." Visionary partners. I zoomed in on the timestamp. The largest wire transfer from my trust fund had cleared that same morning. My phone buzzed with a notification from the front door camera. Grant pulling into the driveway. I closed the app and placed my phone face down. When he walked into the kitchen, he kissed my cheek like nothing had shifted between us. "You saw the message?" he asked casually, loosening his tie. "I saw the transfers," I replied. He hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Just long enough?" "It's temporary," he said. "The company needed short-term capital before a funding round closes. This protects our future." Our future. I asked quietly. You moved over $1 million without asking me. It's marital capital. He countered smoothly. We're married. Natalie, what's mine is yours and vice versa. No, I said, holding his gaze. That account is separate property. You know that. He smiled then. Not warmly. Patiently. Like I was a child misunderstanding a complex rule. You don't understand how corporate shields work, he said. It's structured. It's protected. By the time this funding closes, it'll be irrelevant. Irrelevant. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. Instead, after he went upstairs to shower, I sorted through the mail stacked neatly on the entry table. A large envelope from a regional bank caught my eye. Addressed to both of us. Inside was confirmation of a corporate credit line extension. Listed beneath personal guarantor was my name. And below it, my signature. It looked like mine. The curve of the N, the long stroke in Whitmore. But I had never signed anything agreeing to personally guarantee his company's debt. I stood there in the quiet hallway, the paper trembling slightly in my hands, and felt something inside me settle into place. If he could drain my trust fund and forge my name to secure a loan, this was not a temporary liquidity bridge. This was a calculated exposure, and he had just made the worst mistake of his life. He assumed I would panic. He assumed I would beg. He assumed I would never read the contract we signed before we married. He had no idea what that contract actually said. I didn't sleep the night I found the guarantor document with my signature on it. I lay awake beside Grant, listening to the slow rhythm of his breathing, staring at the ceiling fan turning in lazy circles above us. My mind kept replaying the image of that scanned signature. It looked like mine. The curve of the N, the sharp line under the final E. But I knew I had never agreed to personally guarantee a corporate credit line for Whitmore Technologies. Around 3 a.m, I slipped out of bed and carried the folder into the kitchen. I spread everything across the marble island, the bank letter, the guarantor agreement, the screenshots of my trust fund transfers. Under the recessed lights, it all looked clinical, clean, intentional. This wasn't chaos. It was strategy. We had been married 8 years. 8 years of shared calendars, shared dinners, shared decisions. I had been a marketing director at a hospitality group when we met, organized, detail-oriented, not naive about contracts or numbers. When our son was born, I stepped back from full-time work because Grant's startup demanded everything. I told myself we were investing in our future. Whitmore Technologies had started at our dining table. I designed the first branding deck. I introduced him to 2 early angel investors from my old network. I hosted launch parties. I listened to pitch rehearsals in the kitchen while stirring pasta sauce. But I never agreed to bankroll it with my inheritance. My grandmother's trust fund had been structured as separate property. Protected. Shielded. It wasn't marital liquidity. It was legacy. It was the one financial boundary my family insisted on before the wedding. I could still see the wood-paneled office where we signed the prenup the week before our ceremony. My family's attorney had placed the document between us and carefully walked through the business protection rider. If separate inheritance was ever used as collateral or corporate capital without notarized consent, escalation mechanisms would activate. Grant had laughed softly and squeezed my hand. "This is just paperwork," he said. "We'll never need it." I believed him. By morning, I had made coffee and arranged the documents back into neat stacks before he came downstairs. He kissed my cheek like always and reached for a mug. "We need to talk about the guarantor document," I said. He paused only half a second. It was subtle, but I saw it. Then he smiled. "It's standard spousal acknowledgement. The bank requires it. It lists me as personal guarantor. It's procedural. It doesn't mean they'll come after you." I held his eyes. "I didn't sign it." He set his mug down slowly. "Nat, you did. It was part of the credit line package." "No," I said, steady. "I didn't." Something shifted behind his expression. Irritation. Maybe. Or calculation. "Look," he said, exhaling. The company needed a bridge. One investor delayed funding. I had to secure short-term liquidity. It's temporary. You moved money from my trust fund. It's our financial ecosystem, he replied. You can't isolate assets when the company supports the family. Separate property. I almost said inheritance. Prenup. Instead, I asked, why didn't you tell me? Because you would have panicked, he said. And I didn't have time to debate. I had to act. There it was. He had to act, as if my consent was an obstacle, not a requirement. After he left for the office, I called the bank's private client line. The representative confirmed that the guarantor document on file bore my digital signature. When I asked whether notarized consent was attached, she hesitated. There was no separate notarized affidavit. I asked when the two-step authentication for my trust account had been changed. She told me it had been reassigned to a corporate administrative number several months earlier. Several months. That meant this wasn't a spontaneous emergency. It was preparation. That afternoon, my phone rang again. It was Grant's mother. I hear you're upset about the company financing, she said without greeting. Grant is under enormous pressure. A good wife stands by her husband when he's building something meaningful. My jaw tightened. Did he tell you he used my inheritance? There was a brief silence. It's all family money in the end, she said. No, it wasn't. After I hung up, I opened my laptop and pulled up Whitmore Technologies' recent press releases. Revenue growth percentages, user acquisition claims, bold projections about market expansion. I cross-referenced them with industry databases. The numbers didn't line up. By evening, a certified notification appeared in my email from the bank. I had 10 business days to confirm acknowledgement of the guarantor obligation or risk automatic activation of personal liability. 10 days? If I signed, I validated the exposure. If I refused, I might trigger something that would ripple far beyond our marriage. Grant came home late again. He moved around the kitchen like nothing had shifted, like the foundation beneath us hadn't cracked. I watched him from across the room and understood something I hadn't wanted to see. This wasn't just about a mistress on a yacht or a temporary liquidity bridge. This was about control. And for the first time since I saw that drained balance, I realized I would have to decide whether to protect my marriage or protect myself. I stopped reacting like a wife and started thinking like an investigator. The morning after the bank's 10-day notice, I sat at my desk with a legal pad and wrote down everything I knew. Dates of transfers, amounts, the yacht event in Savannah, the guarantor document, the authentication changes. When I finished, the pattern wasn't emotional anymore. It was strategic. I opened Instagram again and pulled up the photo of Grant on the yacht. Savannah Harbor glittered behind him. A white linen blazer, champagne in his hand, and beside him, Alyssa Kane. I clicked her profile. Partner at Kane Venture Group, early-stage fintech investor, known for aggressive growth plays and rapid-scale expectations. Her feed was a collage of conference stages, private jets, rooftop cocktail receptions, and captions about bold founders who move fast and break ceilings. She had liked nearly every recent Whitmore Technologies post. I searched her name alongside Grant's. Industry blogs mentioned that her firm had been scouting southeastern fintech startups. One article hinted at a pending capital infusion into a Charleston-based disruptor. My stomach turned cold. I checked the date of the largest wire transfer from my trust fund. It cleared the same morning as the yacht event. I pulled up Whitmore Technologies' press release from that week. Exclusive investor showcase celebrating accelerated user growth. It mentioned a private maritime event for strategic partners. I did the math. Catering, venue rental, branding installations, private security, charter costs. It wasn't difficult to see where part of my inheritance had gone. That night, while Grant slept, I searched through publicly available corporate filings and investor decks archived online. I compared the user growth claims in the press releases to independent analytics databases. The numbers didn't align. Reported active users were significantly higher than what third-party data estimated. I stared at the discrepancy for a long time. If projections were inflated to attract funding, then the company wasn't just stretched, it was exposed. The next morning, I made a call I never thought I would have to make. A former colleague from my marketing days had once mentioned a discreet private investigator she trusted during a corporate intellectual property dispute. I asked for the number. Within 48 hours, the investigator sent me a preliminary report. Grant and Alyssa had been seen together multiple times outside formal business settings. Late dinners. A weekend trip listed as a conference that had no conference attached to it. An overnight stay at a boutique hotel in Atlanta. The affair was real. But it wasn't the part that made my hands shake. Attached to the investigator's report was something else. An internal memo draft circulating within Whitmore Technologies about a pending equity restructuring. The memo outlined plans to transfer significant shares into a newly formed holding entity before the close of the upcoming funding round. I didn't need to be a corporate attorney to understand what that meant. If equity shifted into a new structure, tracing ownership in a divorce would become exponentially more complicated. Valuations could be recalculated. Percentages diluted. Paper trails obscured. The memo included a line that made my chest tighten. Once the new structure is executed, legacy exposure becomes negligible. Legacy exposure. Was that how he saw my inheritance? Exposure to eliminate. Later that afternoon, the investigator forwarded a short email Grant had sent to a senior operations manager. We need this restructuring finalized before month end. Timing is critical. Timing. I glanced at the bank's notice on my desk. 10 business days to confirm or dispute the guarantor agreement. If I signed, I would legitimize the credit line secured against inflated projections. If I refused without action, the company might default and the bank could attempt enforcement. And if the restructuring closed before I acted, my leverage would shrink. That evening, I overheard Grant in his office with the door half closed. His voice was low but urgent. She doesn't understand how corporate shields work, he said into the phone. By the time she figures it out, it'll be too late. I stood in the hallway, frozen. Too late for what? For me to stop him. For me to protect what was mine. I walked back into the kitchen and pulled the prenup from the drawer where it had lived untouched for years. I flipped to the business protection rider and read it slowly. Separate inheritance could not be used as collateral. Guarantor backing, or capital infusion without notarized written consent. Any such misuse triggered proportional remedies, including equitable offset tied to corporate valuation. At the time, I had barely registered that language. It felt hypothetical, abstract. Now it felt like the only shield standing between me and financial collapse. The mistress was real. The betrayal was real. But she wasn't the real threat. The real threat was the corporate machine he believed could outrun a contract. I closed the prenup and rested my palm over it. He thought I didn't understand how corporate shields worked. He had forgotten that contracts work both ways. I sat in my car outside the law office in downtown Charleston and stared at the prenup in my lap like it was a map I had once memorized and then forgotten. The building was all glass and steel, reflecting the gray morning sky. People in suits moved in and out with the kind of focus that meant their problems were already in motion. I took a slow breath, gathered the folder, and walked inside. I wasn't there to ask whether my husband had betrayed me. I was there to find out how much damage he had legally exposed me to. The conference room smelled faintly of leather and coffee. My attorney, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a calm voice, flipped through the prenuptial agreement page by page while I explained the transfers, the guarantor document, the authentication changes. When she reached the business protection rider, she slowed down. Did you ever sign a notarized consent allowing your inheritance to be used as corporate collateral? She asked. No. Did you authorize any personal guarantor obligation? No. She tapped the page lightly with her pen. This clause is not decorative. If your separate inheritance was used as capital infusion or collateral without notarized written consent, you have escalation rights. Escalation. The word sounded clinical. Controlled. She read aloud the language I had skimmed years ago. Immediate clawback rights. Injunctive relief to prevent restructuring. Proportional equity offset tied to the value of misused funds. My pulse steadied as she spoke. He believed corporate structure would shield him, she continued. But he signed a contract that specifically addresses corporate misuse. For the first time since I saw my trust fund drained, I felt something shift inside me. Not panic. Leverage. She referred me to a forensic document examiner to review the guarantor agreement. 2 days later, I sat in another office watching a specialist enlarge my supposed signature on a monitor. This was likely lifted from a prior signed document, he said. The digital timestamp metadata doesn't match standard execution sequencing. There's no independent notarization record attached. So it's forged? I asked. He chose his words carefully. It appears your signature was replicated without proper authorization. Without proper authorization. That was the polite version of what it meant. Back at my attorney's office, we laid out the corporate structure of Whitmore Technologies. Parent entity. Subsidiary holding company. Convertible notes issued to early investors. The pending restructuring proposal I had uncovered. He intended to shift equity into a new holding structure before funding closed, she said. If that happened before you acted, tracing proportional value in divorce would become significantly more complicated. So timing matters, I said. Timing is everything. She outlined our options. We could send formal notice enforcing the prenup clause tied to misuse of separate inheritance. We could seek a temporary injunction preventing any equity restructuring until the matter was resolved. We could demand a full corporate accounting of how the transferred funds were used. If you do this, she warned, it will escalate publicly. The board will know. Investors may know. I thought about my son's education account. About the bank's 10-day guarantor notice. About Grant telling someone on the phone that I wouldn't understand corporate shields. I'm not protecting his reputation, I said quietly. I'm protecting my future. That afternoon, she drafted the notice. It cited specific language from the prenup. It identified the amount withdrawn from my trust fund. It referenced the unauthorized guarantor document. It demanded immediate preservation of corporate records and suspension of any equity restructuring pending review. Certified copies were prepared for Grant, for the company's general counsel, and for the board. When Grant came home that evening, I didn't mention the meeting. I watched him instead. He moved through the house with restless energy, phone in hand, muttering about investor timelines. When he noticed me at the dining table reviewing paperwork, he paused. You've been quiet, he said. I've been thinking, I replied. He smiled faintly. About what? About consent. He frowned. Just slightly. Natalie, we're building something bigger than either of us. Sometimes you have to move fast. Not with someone else's inheritance, I said, before he could respond. His phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and whatever he read drained the color from his face. What is it? I asked calmly. He didn't answer. He walked into his office and shut the door. Minutes later, my own phone lit up with a confirmation from my attorney. The notice had been delivered. Within an hour, I received an email from Whitmore Technologies' general counsel requesting an emergency board meeting to address equity control implications. Equity control implications. I opened the prenup again that night and reread the proportional offset language. If the transferred amount equated to a measurable percentage of company valuation at the time of infusion, temporary voting rights tied to that percentage could shift pending resolution. He had believed my inheritance was invisible capital. He had forgotten it was contractually traceable. And now, for the first time since this began, I understood something clearly. I wasn't just trying to get my money back. I was about to walk into his company with rights he never imagined I would use. Grant was standing in the kitchen when the courier delivered the envelope. He turned it over in his hands once, then twice, before tearing it open. I watched his eyes move across the page, watched the confidence drain from his posture in real time. "What did you do?" he asked, looking up at me like I had crossed a line. I enforced the prenup, I said. For a second, he just stared at me. Then he laughed under his breath, sharp and disbelieving. You filed something against my company. I activated a clause you signed. This is insane. Natalie, you're jeopardizing investor confidence. You jeopardized my inheritance. His jaw tightened. It was a temporary capital bridge. It was unauthorized. His phone started ringing before he could respond. He glanced at the screen and ignored it.
It rang again.
And again. Do you have any idea what this looks like? He demanded. If the board thinks there's internal instability, there is internal instability. I interrupted. You used separate property without consent. You forged a guarantor document. That's not stability. He lowered his voice. Think about our son. If this company collapses, what do you think that does to our family? There it was again. My responsibility for his decisions. You made the move, I said quietly. I'm making sure I'm not the one paying for it. He ran a hand through his hair and paced toward the window. You don't understand how high the stakes are. I do now. Within hours. Emails began circulating. I was copied on a formal acknowledgement from corporate counsel confirming receipt of my notice. The pending equity restructuring was temporarily paused pending review of spousal contractual enforcement implications. Grant's phone didn't stop ringing that night. Board members wanted explanations. One investor requested an emergency call. The general counsel asked for documentation regarding the source of recent capital infusions. He came back into the kitchen looking rattled for the first time since this started. You blindsided me, he said. No, I replied. You assumed I wouldn't read. That evening, his mother showed up without warning. She swept into the house like she had every right to referee what she called this misunderstanding. She sat at the dining table, hands folded tightly. You're destroying your own marriage out of pride, she told me. Grant is building something that supports your future. He used my inheritance without permission, I said evenly. It's all family money. No, I answered. It isn't. She shook her head like I was being dramatic. You're acting out of revenge. I looked at her steadily. I'm acting out of protection. After she left, my attorney called. The board is taking this seriously, she said. We're requesting full forensic accounting of how the transferred funds were used. We're also preparing to assert proportional voting control tied to the amount infused. Voting control, I repeated. Yes. If the numbers confirm what we suspect, you may temporarily hold a voting block large enough to influence executive authority. I closed my eyes for a moment. He had moved my trust fund to strengthen his control. He may have just shifted it. That night, Grant confronted me again, this time without anger, just desperation. If the funding round collapses because of this, the valuation tanks, he said. Alyssa's firm is waiting on restructuring closure. If we don't move quickly, they'll walk. So the restructuring had to close before I noticed, I said softly. He didn't answer. That's why you needed the guarantor. I continued. To stabilize numbers long enough to get the term sheet signed? It was strategic, he insisted. It was calculated. I told him I would not confirm the guarantor obligation. I had formally disputed it with the bank. The forensic review would be submitted within days. He stared at me like he didn't recognize me. You're willing to burn this down, he said. I'm unwilling to be collateral. The following morning, I received formal notice of an emergency shareholder meeting scheduled within 72 hours. The agenda included review of equity structure, capital sources, and contractual enforcement claims. My attorney called shortly after. Preliminary valuation suggests the amount withdrawn from your trust fund represents a significant percentage of current equity, she said. If the board recognizes the clause, you could temporarily hold decisive voting weight. Decisive. The word echoed in my chest. 3 weeks ago, I was a wife transferring money into a college fund. Now I was preparing to walk into a boardroom as a contractual force he never believed would activate. He thought I would protect the image. Instead, I was about to protect the contract. The lobby of Whitmore Technologies had never felt colder. I walked in wearing the same navy dress I had worn to our first investor dinner years ago, except this time I wasn't there to smile and support. I was there to enforce. Grant was already inside the glass-walled conference room with the board. When he saw me through the transparent panels, something flickered across his face. Irritation. Disbelief. Maybe even fear. I took a seat beside my attorney without looking at him. The general counsel began the meeting with careful, neutral language. We are here to address contractual enforcement claims raised by Mrs. Whitmore regarding recent capital infusions and equity restructuring. Mrs. Whitmore, not Natalie. Not the founder's wife? My attorney slid a printed copy of the prenuptial agreement across the table. This clause, she said calmly, specifically prohibits the use of separate inheritance as corporate collateral or capital infusion without notarized written consent. No such consent exists. Corporate counsel attempted to redirect, with respect. Marital disputes should not interfere with governance. This is not a marital dispute. My attorney replied, this is a misuse of separate property contractually tied to corporate consequences. The room shifted. The forensic accountant began presenting traced transfers on the screen. Dates. Amounts. Wire confirmations. The path from my trust fund directly into operating accounts. Payroll stabilization. Vendor payments. Event production for the Savannah Investor Showcase. No ambiguity. No commingling. Direct infusion. Grant leaned forward. The funds were temporary, he said. They protected company continuity pending funding closure. They were unauthorized, I said quietly. He didn't look at me. The accountant moved to the next slide. A timeline overlaying the trust fund withdrawals with internal emails about restructuring and projected revenue growth. An investor at the end of the table cleared his throat. Are we certain reported active user numbers align with these projections? Silence. The general counsel shifted in his seat. My attorney spoke again. Under the proportional offset provision, the amount infused represents a measurable percentage of current company valuation at time of transfer. Pending resolution? Equivalent voting control transfers to my client. Murmurs spread around the table. One board member leaned toward Grant. You didn't disclose the capital source. It was marital capital, Grant insisted. It was separate inheritance. I corrected. The difference hung heavy in the air. The general counsel reviewed the bylaws. Under provisional injunction and contractual enforcement, temporary voting recognition had to be acknowledged until a court ruled otherwise. That meant my vote counted. The agenda moved to executive conduct review. Grant tried to regain control. We're on the verge of a major funding round. Public instability right now could sink us. An investor responded bluntly. Undisclosed capital infusions and forged guarantor documents sink companies faster. The word forged landed harder than anything else that morning. My attorney confirmed that forensic signature analysis had found no notarized authorization and clear digital irregularities. Grant's composure cracked just slightly. This is being blown out of proportion. No, I said evenly. It's being documented. The motion was introduced. Initiate independent audit of executive financial representations and temporarily suspend CEO authority pending review. The room went silent. Votes were cast. With the proportional offset, my vote carried weight he never imagined I would hold. The motion passed. Grant stared at the table like he was recalculating something in his head that refused to add up. He was formally suspended pending audit. For a moment, no one spoke. Then chairs shifted. Phones buzzed. Legal counsel began outlining next steps. Across the room, Alyssa Kane rose quietly from her seat. She had attended as an observer representing her firm. She didn't look at me as she left. The champagne from Savannah suddenly felt very far away. After the meeting adjourned, Grant approached me in the hallway. You're destroying everything, he said under his breath. You destroyed it when you decided consent didn't matter. I replied. He shook his head. You could have handled this privately. You didn't handle it privately, I said. You handled it secretly. By evening. News of the internal audit had begun circulating through investor networks. The pending term sheet from Alyssa's firm was placed under review. My attorney called me once I was home. The independent audit will examine revenue reporting accuracy, she said. If discrepancies are confirmed, regulatory scrutiny may follow. I stood in the kitchen where this had all started, staring at the marble counter where I had first seen $8,000 instead of $1.6 million. He had believed corporate structure would shield him. He had believed I would protect the image at all costs. Instead, the contract he dismissed years ago had followed him into his own boardroom. And now, the outcome was no longer in his hands. My attorney called 3 weeks after the board vote. The audit is complete, she said. I was sitting in my car outside my son's school. Engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel. The late afternoon sun cut through the windshield. Warm and ordinary. Nothing about the world looked like it was shifting. What did they find? I asked. Material overstatements in projected user growth. Deferred liabilities not clearly disclosed in investor summaries. And confirmation that your trust fund transfers were used to stabilize operational cash flow during those reporting periods. I closed my eyes. So it wasn't just reckless. It was documented. The board reconvened within 48 hours. This time, there was no tension about whether my prenup clause applied. That fight had already been decided. Now it was about executive accountability. Grant sat at the head of the table again. But the seat looked different under him. Smaller. Less secure. The independent auditor presented findings in careful, measured language. Words like discrepancy, material variance, incomplete disclosure. One investor leaned back in his chair and asked the question no one had wanted to say out loud before. Were investors misled? Corporate counsel answered cautiously. The reporting requires further review for compliance exposure. That was enough. The motion was introduced to formally remove Grant as CEO pending regulatory clarification and appoint interim leadership. He tried to argue. These were forward-looking projections, he insisted. Every startup adjusts numbers. Every startup doesn't inject undisclosed personal capital while doing it. One board member replied, "The vote was quicker this time." He lost, just like that. The man who once paced our kitchen rehearsing pitches for venture capitalists was escorted out of his own office by the end of the week. His access credentials were revoked. His company email disabled. News traveled fast in the fintech world. Industry blogs reported leadership transition amid governance review. They didn't use the word fraud. Not yet. But the implication hovered in every paragraph. Alyssa's firm formally withdrew its tentative funding commitment. Within days, she removed photos from the yacht event from her public profile. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't messy. It was strategic distancing. The same way he had distanced my inheritance from my consent. The bank responded to our formal submission of forensic findings regarding the guarantor document. The signature was deemed unauthorized. The credit line was restructured without my personal liability attached. The weight I had been carrying in my chest since the 10-day notice first arrived finally eased. My inheritance was no longer collateral. My son's future was no longer leveraged against inflated projections. My attorney filed the formal demand under the Prenup clawback clause for reimbursement of the misused funds. Grant asked to meet privately before the paperwork advanced further. We sat across from each other at the dining table that had once held investor pitch decks and birthday cakes. He looked exhausted. Not angry. Not defensive. Just tired. "You could have handled this differently," he said. "How?" I asked. "We could have kept it internal. You moved my inheritance without telling me." I replied, "You forged my name. You inflated projections. What part of that was internal?" He ran a hand over his face. "You destroyed my career." I held his gaze. "I enforced a contract." He didn't argue after that. "When I filed for divorce, I did it quietly." Grounds cited financial misconduct and breach of trust. The documentation made it difficult for his counsel to posture for long. Settlement discussions began quickly. He threatened to fight at first. Then the weight of the audit findings and the potential for regulatory scrutiny seemed to recalibrate his risk tolerance. We reached a settlement that returned the full principal of my trust fund, along with adjustments tied to the proportional equity offset period. Whitmore Technologies survived under interim leadership. Valuation dipped but didn't collapse. Investors stabilized once governance reforms were announced. Grant's name, however, remained attached to the controversy. Invitations to speak at conferences stopped. His phone rang less. He had risked my inheritance to appear powerful. Now credibility was the asset he could not reclaim. One night, after our son had fallen asleep, I sat at the edge of his bed and watched him breathe. I thought about what could have happened. If I had signed the guarantor confirmation, if I had ignored the authentication change, if I had chosen silence over enforcement, my inheritance could have vanished entirely. Personal liability could have activated. The restructuring could have closed before I ever understood what it meant. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. Revenge had never been my objective. Protection had... And now that the legal storm was settling, I had one final decision left to make. What to do with the power and security I had fought to recover. The final mediation session took place on a quiet Tuesday morning in a downtown Charleston office that overlooked the harbor. Grant and I sat across from each other at a long polished table, our attorneys on either side, documents stacked in careful piles between us. There were no raised voices, no dramatic accusations. Just paper, ink, and the steady awareness that this was the formal ending of something I had once believed would last a lifetime. The settlement terms were read aloud in measured tones. Full reimbursement of the misused trust fund principal. Financial adjustment reflecting the temporary equity control period I had held during the corporate review. Removal of any and all guarantor liability tied to Whitmore Technologies. Division of marital property under the terms of the prenup we had signed 8 years earlier. Grant signed first. His pen hovered for a moment before touching paper, as if the weight of what had unraveled was finally settling on him. When the documents were passed to me, my hand did not shake. I signed my name clearly. There was no triumph in that room, only closure. In the months that followed, I exercised the remaining provisional voting authority granted under the offset clause. Once the company stabilized under interim leadership and compliance reforms were implemented, I negotiated a structured exit. The voting shares tied to the misused inheritance were sold at adjusted valuation. The funds were transferred back into a protected trust structure under stricter oversight, with independent trustees and authentication protocols that could not be altered without my direct consent. I didn't reinvest in another startup. I didn't chase the thrill of rapid growth or high-risk returns. I rebuilt stability. I returned to consulting part-time in brand strategy, working with small hospitality businesses along the Carolina coast. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't headline-worthy. It was mine. For years, I had confused loyalty with silence. I had believed that protecting a marriage meant smoothing over discomfort, trusting without verification, assuming good intent even when warning signs flickered at the edges. Now I understood something different. Boundaries are not hostility. Transparency is not distrust. And contracts are not symbols of pessimism. They are acknowledgments of human imperfection. One evening, I took my son to the beach just before sunset. The sky was streaked with pink and gold, waves folding gently against the shore. He ran ahead of me, shoes in hand, laughing as the tide chased his ankles. "Why doesn't Dad live with us anymore?" he asked later, when we sat side by side in the sand. I kept my answer simple. "Sometimes adults make decisions that hurt trust," I said. "And when trust breaks, we have to fix things in a different way." He nodded, accepting it in the uncomplicated way children do. As I watched him build a small fortress of wet sand, I realized that the true inheritance I had protected wasn't just financial. It was an example. He would grow up seeing that boundaries matter, that signatures matter, that love does not require surrendering protection. Grant and I saw each other occasionally during custody transitions. The anger had drained out of our conversations, replaced by a quiet distance. "You could have handled it differently," he said once. as our son ran inside ahead of him. "I handled it legally," I replied. There was nothing more to add. I thought often about the prenup, the clause he had dismissed with a smile before our wedding. At the time, it had felt like paperwork. In the end, it was the line that separated collapse from survival. He believed corporate shields would protect him. He believed timing would outrun scrutiny. He believed I would hesitate long enough for restructuring to erase exposure. What he never understood was that enforcement is not revenge. It is accountability. The day my trust fund drained, I thought I had lost everything. My sense of safety, my marriage, my future. But what I actually lost was the illusion that silence protects love. What I gained was something far more durable: control, clarity, and the confidence to act before it was too late. If you ever find yourself staring at numbers that don't make sense, at signatures you don't remember giving, at explanations that feel smoother than the truth, pause, gather documents, read the fine print, ask the uncomfortable questions. Protection is not cruelty. It is responsibility. And if you believe prenuptial agreements weaken marriages, I invite you to think about what happens when trust is tested without one. Have you ever ignored a financial red flag because you trusted someone completely? Would you have acted sooner? Or waited, hoping it would resolve itself? I would truly like to hear your thoughts. Share your perspective in the comments. Stories like this are not just about revenge or betrayal. They are about reclaiming power, protecting what matters, and learning that strength sometimes looks quiet and procedural rather than explosive. If this story resonated with you, stay with me. There are more stories about hidden power, family drama, and the moment the tables turn when someone underestimated the wrong woman. And if you want to hear them, make sure you're subscribed. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't destruction, it's enforcement. And sometimes, the clause you almost ignored is the one that changes everything.